So this chart shows you the median home price to median household income ratio in the United States. At the time of recording this video, it's now higher than it was just a couple of years before the housing bubble collapse. Other countries might be seeing a similar trend. Is housing affordability becoming worse? And if so, why? To help us navigate this question with me is a special guest who spent the better part of his life analyzing housing markets. He's director of the Center for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam University, and he's also managing editor of the Journal of Housing Studies. Professor Ed Ferrari, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, you're welcome, Sharky. It's good to be here.
All right. So can you see the chart here? Do you agree that based on the studies that you've seen, do you think that this trend is true?
Yeah, it's undoubtedly true. I know this data is from the US. It's very similar experiences in other countries, but I recognize this pattern in the UK. I think some countries experiences swings, the volatility a little bit higher. So the US tends to, I think, have higher volatility. So the downswing following the financial crisis in 2008, arguably a little bit more severe, and therefore the sort of climb back. But that reversion to the previous trajectory that we've seen since the late 90s is something I definitely recognise. So affordability is really the number one housing issue in the UK, as it would be in the US. The housing markets are really unusual. We often, as housing economists, are always like to say it's not like a market for chocolate bars or something, some simple commodity like that. Housing is a really complex commodity. You buy a house, you're not just buying the bricks or the mortar or the roof over your head. You're buying access to amenities, access to services, access to labour markets. You're buying neighbours. You're buying into a social world as well. So it's a really complex commodity. But I think what we've seen, certainly over the last 40 years, possibly longer in countries like the United States, is that housing has become more of an investment. So the investment function of housing has become more important than just its shelter function. And so that means it responds to macroeconomic conditions in a slightly different way than it might have done, sort of going back to the earlier half of the 20th century, for example.
Interesting. Now, I mean, you mentioned there's a lot of complex factors, but like if you boil them down, would you say that the answer is basically a supply and demand factor, and that's basically what we are dealing with at the moment?
Yes, but I like any market, supply and demand comes into it. Of course, it does. But I think the housing market, the achievement of equilibrium in the market operates over very long terms. So if you were to pump X thousand new houses into a particular locality, it won't bring prices down instantaneously. A lot of things have to happen. There's stickiness in the housing market. People have got to think about moving. They have to actually move. People have then got to move into the house they vacate. And those chains of transactions take quite a long time to work their way through any particular market. But moreover, because of the fundamentals of the housing market, things like demography, people's incomes, so therefore the economy, the labour market, those are the fundamental drivers of the housing market. Those things can take quite a long time to shift around as well, particularly demography. So obviously, what happens now demographically in terms of birth rates in terms of migration patterns and so on, could take several years, could even take generations to work their way through a particular local housing market. So yes, supply and demand are important, but it's not like turning a switch on. These things actually take a huge amount of time to work their way through.
It's not like you're going to the vegetable market or buy tomatoes or something, like several years. I mean, it takes some time to build the housing, to get the license and all of that.
Exactly. If there's a bad crop one year, price of tomatoes sort of goes up, and it's quite dynamic. The elasticities are such that things correct themselves quite quickly. In the housing market, it's really quite different. There was quite a lot of good work in the UK to look at the elasticities, cross price elasticity of new supply, which basically means how quickly does the price of housing snap to where it should be when you make some supply side intervention. And the answer is not really that quickly. It takes a long time.
Now, I've mentioned that you're the director of the Regional Economic and Social Research, and you recently came out with a report called The Invisible Hand That Keeps Taking, which is what I found fascinating. Can you talk a bit, about that report? What did you find in it?
Yeah, so that report was authored by a couple of my colleagues in our university, and it was motivated by a concern that not just their concern, there's been a widespread concern in the UK that the supply side of the housing market is not as competitive as it could be. And so, to give a couple of examples of what that means in practice, it means that the major housing developers, and this does differ by country. So different countries have different structures, institutional structures and market structures. But in the UK, new house building is largely the responsibility of the private sector. And most of the activity is concentrated in about 10 major house builder developer companies, mostly publicly listed. So their number one responsibility, of course, is to their shareholders as publicly listed companies, but they have a huge amount of market power. And there have been some concerns over a long period of time expressed by different governments, for example, in the UK, that maybe this structure it's not quite a monopoly, right? But you've got a lot of power in, relatively small number of very large companies. And the concern is, do they respond to market signals in the way that the market trader for tomatoes that we were just talking about earlier would respond to market signals? So if a market signal is there's huge pent up demand for housing because affordability metrics are climbing and climbing, why can't we just turn the tap on and build more housing? There's going to be profit in that, right? Well, what that report says is house builders tend not to think there is profit in turning the tap on. They like to keep the tap at just the right level, and that keeps prices controlled. And so therefore, there's a sort of lack of incentives in the market for those house builders to respond to market signals. And another thing that leads into that is that they generally compete on location, right? So you've probably heard the maxim that the three most important things in the housing market are location, location, and location. And so these house builders are not really competing so much on the quality of their product, the architectural layouts or the space standards or the building materials or the fit and the finish of their product, in the same way that car makers would compete on those things. What this report says is that whilst those things might be important, mainly house builders are competing on land, the location, the land that they can acquire, and then the intrinsic value of those locations. So the better the land, the easier to develop that land, the better located it is with respect to other things like amenities, the broader neighborhood, and so on. That's where profits can be can be sort of driven from.
So maybe the increase in housing unaffordability, to a certain extent, not completely, part of it might be to the way housing investments work.
I think there's a number of different factors that drive what we're seeing as a kind of global affordability crisis. It's, I think I have not really come across a country where anybody's saying to me, yeah, we've got the housing system totally dialed in, affordability is not a concern. So I think it's a global issue. And I think there's a number of different factors. Housing in many societies is a really important asset, and that asset class is something that can be easily handed down between generations. And so we see that because of that simple fact that people leave, when they die, they leave their housing, in many cases, uh, to their sons and daughters or to other family members, and it's not very heavily taxed in many uh, countries. Those inheritances are not very heavily taxed. The housing market becomes the number one driver over the long term of inequality. And so when we look at affordability metrics, we're looking at averages. But what it doesn't tell us is actually there's a huge number of people that can afford that housing, and there's a huge number of people that can't afford that housing. So really the metric that we probably should be better at communicating is the distribution of affordability, rather than the average affordability. Because somebody's buying these houses, right? That's why the price is being set. But I think a real key thing is that unless governments sort of do something actively to intervene, the housing market will just continue to drive social inequalities. So those that were lucky enough in the early days of a housing market boom to have property and then to pass that on to future generations, those future generations start off in a more privileged position, and then a generation later, their sons and daughters benefit from that as well, and so the whole thing kind of widens out these divisions in society. So social inequalities is a really important driver of that, because the power, the purchasing power of those that can benefit from inheritances or other advantage sort of outstrips everything else, and it drives those things up. So investment, yes. I think the increase of housing as an investment class in most societies really has had an effect, but it's also about how we see housing as an asset. So I think one of the things that's really interesting to compare as societies is the home ownership rate. So in the UK, the home ownership rate is around about 67, 68%, something like that, maybe a little bit less now. It has sort of slid down recently. Countries like Spain traditionally have a very high home ownership rate, maybe up into the 90%. The US is probably, somewhere in between. Germany, Switzerland, those countries, those have much lower home ownership rates, where the private rental market is much more important. So you have different dynamics there. So I think it's sometimes useful to look at the kind of cultural embeddedness of home ownership, and therefore of housing as an asset class amongst ordinary people, when looking at these kind of questions of social inequality. And as I say, governments can do things. They can tax inheritances. It's never popular. It's politically considered quite a dangerous place to go. But if it wants to put the brakes on some of those gaps widening up, it could think about tax policy. It can think about some other things like that.
from like I would like your opinion on this based on what you've said. Like, I mean, there is more income inequality these days. I mean, based on some of the data at the moment, and maybe like you see all these posts on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and so many millennials who say they're never gonna afford a house. But I've read something that basically people on the lower end of the income spectrum, they're struggling much more proportionally compared to people who are at the higher end of the income spectrum. Is would you say that's a big part of housing um, unaffordability? Is like income inequality is causing a certain subset of the population to struggle much more to afford housing?
Definitely. But I think the added dimension is not just about the take home pay. And there has been an increase in inequality in take home pay, absolutely. But what's really been damaging is, particularly for those on lower incomes in many societies like the UK, the US, has been the move towards more precarious forms of employment. So sometimes we call it in the UK the gig economy. So you kind of have to hustle in a sense. You may be an Uber driver, or you may be delivering food on a or using a kind of platform economy model, and you don't know where your next paycheck's coming from. And lenders in the housing market really don't like that. Yeah, they like salaried people. They like people that have got permanent jobs. And so I think as as those that have higher salaries don't just have higher salaries, they tend to have better job security. Lenders like job security, and therefore the rates that lenders will charge, so how they price their mortgage products, varies according not only to your income but to the stability of your employment. How much risk that lender thinks there's going to be in you defaulting a payment. And if you don't know where your next paycheck's coming from because you're on a 0 hours contract, or you've maybe got a number of different side hustles in order to supplement your income, that's not particularly attractive to a lender from a risk perspective compared to someone who has a job with a big corporation, or local government or something like that, and they've got a slightly more secure outlook in terms of their employment. So job precarity has become an issue. Um, that means lenders may be willing to lend you less. Uh, the I think the other issue is what's the loan to value ratio that lenders are willing to offer. Now, there's been some easing of that in the UK. I don't know so much about other mortgage markets, but following the global crisis in 2008, the one thing that did as lenders is they really, really focused on those loan to values. And in fact, the kind of governance of the whole banking structures were forcing the lenders to look at loan to value ratios, because in the run up to the bursting of the bubble, some lenders were considered to be lending too much too much loan to value. So the value of the property wasn't really enough to kind of sustain the value of the loan that was being lent. So you might have got people not having to put any deposit down, for example, before the crash, but then after the crash, very quickly there was a tightening of that regime, and ordinary households that want to get on the housing ladder suddenly need quite big deposits. Now, where are those deposits going to come from? You either have to really save over many, many, many years to get that deposit together, or you rely on what we in the UK call the bank of mum and dad, or the bank of mom and pop, or whatever in the US, and that brings us back to the inheritances thing, and basically how wealthy your parents are.
Interesting. I'm going to play the devil advocate for a couple of charts here. So I'm just going to share my screen for one chart here. All right. Okay. So, I mean, we're seeing that housing prices and affordability is becoming less so. So if you look at this chart right now, this shows the home ownership rate and rental vacancies in the United States. And in the past, like maybe few years, like it hasn't really been going down. Like if you expect home prices to go up, you'd expect that home ownership rate would also go down. So how are people? Why is the home ownership rate not really going down? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Um, well, I have a couple of thoughts. One reason I think is that I can't really speak so authoritatively about the US, and it varies from city to city. Um, but in the UK, outside, let's say, London and some other major cities, the rental market is not very mature. So, what would I mean by a mature rental market? Well, I think a mature rental market is one where you have a broad range of different products at different price points, and there is sufficient supply in that market to kind of meet demand. Rental markets, particularly private rented houses, so again, this differs from country to country, from city to city, but in the UK, by far, preferences are focused on detached or semi-detached houses, single-family houses. Um, some countries and some cities, there has much more of a preference for multiple family units, like condos or apartments and so on. In the UK, it's really the preferences are driven by houses, usually with a small garden, a bit of parking for a car, that sort of type of thing. And the the private rental market doesn't really provide much of that. I mean, it's getting a bit better now, but traditionally, what the private rented market in the UK would focus on was either really people with very low incomes that didn't have many other options. Um, so maybe really small studio apartments or really small apartments with one or two bedrooms. At the lower end of the market, usually in neighborhoods that, weren't the most desirable neighborhoods, or they focused on the really high end of the market. They may be focused on a labour market which is very global, which might be coming into London or another major city like Edinburgh, on a 2-year assignment or something, and they just want to rent a nice property and then move on. So the high end and the low end, but that major middle part of the market is not catered very well by private landlords. Now that's changed a little bit in the last few years, but by and large, I think if households are unable to afford owner-occupied housing, and they're not lucky enough to be allocated a social home, a home that's provided by government, of which there are very few, then they're kind of left to the vagaries of a not particularly well functioning private rental market. And so if they can't, if they're a family and they can't find a home to rent, then what they do is they technically become homeless. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they're on the streets, but they can't really afford a home of their own. So they may be going into suboptimal housing situations, like sharing with their parents or, joining households together. And so what we then tend to see, I think, when there's high levels of unaffordability and lots of people that can't afford housing, and a private rental market that's not really capable of meeting their needs, and a social system which doesn't really provide much, is that people have to kind of make do, and so you see the average size of households increase, and you see the increase of phenomena like sofa surfing, which is maybe kind of younger people that are just living on friends' sofas for an extended period of time, and then they're going to find another friend to live with for a period of time, and so on.
Interesting. I don't know if you've seen, this is news I saw today, and I wanted your opinion on it. So this is in the United States, and the news is, I'm going to read some of it for you. The headline is Democrats introduce bill banning hedge funds from owning single family homes. And it's called the End Hedge Fund Control of American Homes Act of 2023. And what it does is that it would require hedge funds to sell off their stock of single family homes over the next 10 years. And then there would be an outright ban. What do you think of that as a government policy to help with the affordability situation?
I think it sounds positive from my perspective. I think, and I can't really comment, with a great deal of authority about the US, but the more, to go back to what I said earlier, I think the more that housing has been seen as an investment class, that kind of disassociates the value of that home in market terms from its kind of value as providing shelter and providing a home for a family, then that's likely to kind of expose the housing market to the vagaries of other asset classes. So a really good example of this in the UK was in the early 2000s, when other asset classes were really not performing very well. A lot of money started switching into housing because traditional asset classes like bonds or stocks and shares weren't performing in comparative terms to the kind of yields that investors thought that they might get by switching into housing. And so you saw this kind of pumping of investment into housing as an asset class, largely as a response, I suppose, to the poor performance of other asset classes. So I think what that sort of says to me is that if housing plays a really important social purpose, we all need to be housed. It's a kind of fundamental human right that we should have some kind of shelter and some reasonably decent place to live. But you're exposing the main mechanism for providing that social good to something that can be buffeted about by crosswinds in other markets, in other asset classes. So if suddenly the housing market becomes dependent on what stocks and shares are doing, or the housing market becomes dependent on or affected by what's happening in the bond market or the futures market or any other type of asset class, then I think you've got some problems there, because it's very difficult to provide a social good when you're not really kind of controlling, you're not in full control of some of the sort of key fundamental aspects of that market.
Interesting. One more, I'm going to play the devil advocate one more. I'm going to share another chart here. All right. So this is, and I'm sure this is similar in other countries as well. This shows the average number of people per household in the United States. Okay, and you can see from the 1960 until today, it's been going down, meaning that the demand for bigger houses, I would say, is larger. So maybe that plays a role in the recent increase in housing prices. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think, we would see that trend in other places as well. It's certainly a trend I would recognise in the UK. Part of it is changing social norms. So in many countries, the norm has been multi-generational living for a long period of time, and the kind of more Western approach to nuclear families living in their own homes has sort of started to trickle into other societies as well, and driven up the demand for housing. That is basically, not so much focused on the kind of multi-generational household, but this kind of single nuclear family unit. Other social trends around kind of delaying the formation of partnerships, delaying the formation of families or having children. Those things have also tended to keep the average household size relatively low and sort of reducing. And so, of course, as the average household size reduces and population stays the same or increases, obviously that increases the demand for housing units. And so that will have a long run impact on house prices.
Now, me myself, I haven't bought a house just yet, and part of the reason is, at least in my case, the interest rates are very high at the moment. Whenever I talk with people in my situation, they're like, we should wait for another recession and then try and go for a house. What do you think of that advice? Difficult question.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. Interest rates, I guess they vary from country to country. In the UK, our interest rates are higher than they've been in the last 20 years or so. I mean, we had an almost zero interest rate environment for many years, and that really did drive a lot of housing market activity as well. So I was talking earlier about the pricing of mortgages, and before the global financial crisis, interest rates were historically low for an unprecedented period of time, and that drove activity in the housing market as well, and arguably contributed to that sort of slight bubble effect that we saw. But what I think governments have done since the crisis is that they've used a number of different fiscal and macroeconomic measures to try and make sure that the housing market is kind of propped up to the greatest possible degree. I think, unlike previous recessions, there was a real concern that in 2008 that a crisis which largely grew out of subprime lending and was very much associated with housing could really be damaging to the housing market, and that could be damaging to millions and millions of ordinary people who would suddenly find themselves being foreclosed and losing their homes. So I think a lot of things were done by governments to kind of prop the housing market up, which I think socially was probably necessary, but has had quite long run ramifications. So there's been a huge amount of quantitative easing in the post financial crisis environment, where billions and trillions of dollars and pounds have been pumped in to economies, and in the housing market, that's taken on particular expressions. So I think what that's meant is that those that are kind of active in the housing market, the lenders and the house builders, have been able to operate with a degree of confidence that governments have got their back, and that sort of led to some extent to the situation described in that report you mentioned earlier, the invisible hand that keeps on giving, in a sense, because there's been a huge amount pumped into housing markets to make sure that kind of collapse of the housing as a social good didn't really happen. But what I do come back to is I think a lot depends on your personal situation. Just to answer your question directly, what should you do? Should you wait? Should you buy? If you need a home and you're planning to be in the same location for a long time, then go for it, I would say. if you see buying a home as a really important part of your personal um, approach to wealth, so are you going to use your home to fund other things? Then how that home performs in value is going to be hugely important to you. Um, so if you are lucky enough to live, or unlucky enough, I suppose, to live in a high value housing market, which where it might be really difficult and you really have to extend yourself to afford that home. But then you work in a sector that would enable you to move to a cheaper area and really unlock the capital in that home, you'll win. But if you work in a sector where that option is not available to you, then you're not going to win. So people, post COVID, for example, I think people who work in sectors that have been able to work remotely have really benefited from that, because you could see them moving out of high price cities like New York or London and living in slightly cheaper suburban locations and still being able to do the work without commuting 5 days a week. And they've really won out in the housing market. So it really does come back to your own personal strategy, in a sense. The one thing I would say is no one should ever overextend themselves. And there was a
Yeah.
time, when lenders were really pushing, as I said, high loan to value, um, interest only deals where you don't have to pay you're only ever paying the interest on your loan. You're not paying back any of the capital. Um, I always think those sound like a bad idea unless you really do your maths properly.
Yeah. I mean, the issue with me personally is that I've been quoted an APR of 14% for a 30-year mortgage. And my landlord is such a nice guy. He said he'd never increase the price of rent. So in my situation, at least, makes sense not to buy. But I mean, depending on everyone
Yeah,
else's situation.
does really depend on what you're paying in the private market, and if you have a forgiving landlord like that, you can be you should see that rent that you're not paying, if you like. You should capitalize that. Um, in the UK, there's a very small number of people that live in rent controlled apartments. And in some countries, in some cities, New York, for example, if you're lucky enough to live in a rent controlled apartment, you should see that as a real benefit that you need to capitalize. And you may be foolish to move into owner occupation if you've got
All right.
rent control. So it really does depend on kind of what your current rental situation is, but making sure you capitalize it, because if you've got rent control, if your rent's capped and you're not saving the difference between the market rent and what you pay, investing it in some other way, then you're not going to win out. But if you take that difference between the market rent, what you would otherwise pay, and what you are paying, and you invest it somehow, then you're doing a really clever thing.
Because I think a lot of people, they look into like a house as an investment, right? It's something that's going to grow in value over time. Like, for a lot of people, maybe it makes sense to just take the money and put it into like a low risk kind of investment. And that might, like, eventually, once that grows to a certain point, you just buy the house instead of, paying the down payment and then being at the risk of the mortgage rate and all of that. What do you think of that, kind of advice?
I think it depends on the long run yields, that you might get on those low risk investments versus what you might get in the housing market. It is difficult. I mean, housing markets do have a degree of volatility at time, but then so do other markets. And some people do get their fingers burnt. But over the long term, sometimes economists say they're not making more land, and housing is fundamentally tied to land, and there's a fixed stock of it, generally speaking. Um, and for all of the demographic reasons and social reasons that you talked about, housing is a pretty safe bet in the long run. But the difficulty is that for individual ordinary households, you're not only, it's not only is it the most expensive purchase you'll ever make, it's something you need to use. It's not like buying a classic car that you can just put in a garage and hope that it's going to go up in price, because you don't drive it every day. You don't need to use it every day. You need to live in your house, and it needs to be in a place that works for you, for the near to where your kids are going to school, near to where you work, near to where you worship. All of those things that might come into play, you're tied into your investment as well. So it's got to work as an investment, but that's why it's really tricky. It's got to work for you, but it's also got to work as an investment.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned earlier governments have switched up how they deal with the housing markets after the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, people are going to ask me, like, when you interviewed Professor Ed Ferrari, did you ask him this question? So I have to ask you this question. Do you think some markets will be 2008, basically? Or is this paradigm for the increase in housing prices, is it different than back then?
No, I think 2008 could happen again. I think we're probably in many places sleepwalking back into bubble type of territory. When I look at affordability ratios in some UK cities that have some quite tenuous fundamental underpinnings in terms of the strength of the economy, in terms of the kind of demographics and so on, you begin to think that looks to me like that asset is becoming overpriced, you know. So I think there is danger. Of course, governments learn. They also are pretty bad at remembering things sometimes. But I think there's obviously governments have a huge amount of experience now, and central banks as well, which are really critically important on this. And again, that's a thing that varies from place to place. You know, whether you can set independently set interest rates or not as a central bank, and you know how tied in to government are some of the setting of these key macroeconomic levers. All of these things vary, but there is more experience now of how to kind of deal with a shock like what happened in 2008. But that said, there's also differences as well. There's other things, you know, happening. We're in a volatile global situation, you know, around things like, you know, conflict, migration. All of these things can kind of change things quite quickly. I suppose they introduce new challenges. Climate change is a big factor as well. Part of the price you pay. I was hearing this from somebody who was telling me the other day that they found a really cheap property in a lovely neighborhood. They wanted to buy it. They could get a mortgage, no problem, but they couldn't get insurance. They couldn't get insurance because it's too close to a river. 5 years ago, the insurance companies didn't care so much about that, or they didn't price that risk in quite as high as they do now. But we've got climate change now, and we've had, you know, a pattern of 3 or 4 years of extreme weather events in the UK, which have flooded homes. So suddenly, insurance companies are really pricing that risk very high. So it's not just about what the housing market does. Climate has an action on the housing market as well. And all of these things evolve and sometimes take governments by surprise. So I would never rule out the fact that you could have another crash.
Interesting. Okay, so I know you need to go. Just one last question, just to sum up the whole discussion. So, homes have been becoming more unaffordable, right? And if you would you say it's easy to tell what is making them more affordable, and if it is, what would be the main contributing factor, as a summary of what we discussed?
So for me, most countries have a high degree, or at least some degree, of geographic difference between sort of high pressure housing market areas and low pressure housing market areas. So different cities, and underneath that is the economy. And I think governments can do quite a lot which they tend not to. They tend to be a bit squeamish about trying to redistribute the economy, the underlying economy. They tend to sort of really want to back their strong cities. So London gets a disproportionate amount of investment. The argument being it's the number one city in the UK. It drives very much the global economy in many ways. It's really important to protect, so it's got to be invested in. But if that is to the disbenefit of other cities that are not getting the same share of investment in things like transportation or just investment in local services, or investment in strategies that can help create jobs, like investment in universities, for example, or innovation, then you're not doing anything to benefit the housing market. You're just going to overheat some part of the country. Whereas if you could take the heat out of it and spread it around, that I think helps. So I think the one thing that seems to me that governments don't tend to take seriously is the idea that the housing market is very much a reflection of the economy as well. So if you can really bolster people's incomes in areas, I mean, that's the other thing you can do is that you can help increase incomes. Yeah, not just try to keep prices down. You can also help people to afford stuff as well. So you can do stuff in economic policy, which is about, I think, supporting the development and growth of local economies as well.
All right. So I would like to say thank you very much, Professor Ed Ferrari from Sheffield Hallam University.
Yeah, thanks, Sharky. Thanks for speaking to me. It's been really great to talk to you.